The heat of the day had settled deep into the leather of the bridle I was mending. The smell of wax and worn hide was the only thing that felt real. My stitches were small and even, a line of dark thread against the pale, cracked strap. It was my father's, and the work was a way of holding onto a piece of him that wasn't just a memory shaped by absence. 3 years he'd been gone, vanished on a surveying trip into the territories. They'd found his horse, his pack, but never him. The world had moved on, and I had learned to move with it, my grief a smooth, worn stone I carried in my pocket. The dust from the yard drifted in through the open barn door, catching in the shafts of late afternoon sun. A horse stamped in its stall. The rhythmic pull of the needle through leather was a kind of metronome, counting out the seconds of my quiet, structured life. Then, the rhythm broke. The sound of a buggy, its wheels crunching on the dry track leading to our small ranch, was an intrusion. We had few visitors. The sound was thin and sharp in the heavy air. I put down the bridle, my fingers stiff. I wiped my hands on my dark brown pants, the rough canvas familiar and grounding. A man in a town suit was climbing down from the buggy, a folio under his arm. He looked out of place, a black crow in a field of brown sparrows. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, a lawyer from the county seat. His voice was dry, like papers left too long in the sun. He said he had news regarding my father, Samuel. For a disorienting moment, hope flared, a treacherous, painful thing. I held it back. I had learned that hope was a poor currency. "Your father's estate has been settled," he said, not meeting my eyes. He looked at the barn wall, at a rusty horseshoe hanging on a nail. "He has been declared legally deceased." The words were just words. I had been living the reality of them for 3 years. But hearing them spoken aloud, with the finality of the law, was different. It was like a door slamming shut in a distant room. I nodded. I did not offer him water. "There isn't much," he continued, opening his folio. "The ranch here is leased, as you know. But there is one parcel of land. 70 acres, held free and clear. It was his first claim, filed years ago. It's undeveloped. Scrubland, mostly. The deed is now in your name." He slid a piece of paper across the dusty workbench. My name, Cora, was written in a neat, looping script beneath my father's. 70 acres of nothing. It felt like a final, useless gift. A punchline to a long, unfunny joke. "There are back taxes owed," Mr. Abernathy added, his gaze still fixed on the horseshoe. "A pittance, really. But if they aren't paid, the county will seize the property." He named a sum that was small, but not insignificant to me. I had little. I had this work, mending tack for other ranchers. I had the small vegetable garden I kept behind the house. I had my father's memory, and now I had 70 acres of worthless land and a debt attached to it. I filed the information away, a habit my father had taught me. Observe, record, decide later. I registered the way the lawyer's collar was too tight, the sweat beading on his temple despite the shade of the barn. I noticed he never once said he was sorry. He was a messenger, delivering a piece of information that closed a file for him and tore a quiet scar open for me. I took the deed. My thumb traced the shape of my father's signature. The paper was crisp, official. It felt heavier than it should. "I'll see to the taxes," I said. My voice was steady. It was the only thing I could control. He nodded, relieved. His business was done. He climbed back into his buggy and drove away, leaving another cloud of dust to settle over my life. I stood there for a long time, holding the deed, the smell of leather and wax filling the quiet air. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows of the barn timbers stretched long and thin across the floor, like bars. The journey to the property took 2 days by horse. The land was exactly as the lawyer had described it, worthless. It was a rough patch of high desert, all rock and sun-baked earth, dotted with stubborn sagebrush and skeletal junipers. The wind was a constant, a low moan that scraped at the silence. There was no water, no sign of life beyond a few lizards skittering over the hot stones. I couldn't imagine why my father had ever claimed this place, let alone held onto it for all these years. In the center of the 70 acres stood a small, dilapidated cabin. It was barely more than a shack, its wood bleached gray by the sun and scoured by the wind. The door hung crooked on one hinge. The single window was a dark, empty square. It looked like a place where things ended. I tethered my horse to a dead tree and pushed open the door. It groaned, a sound of protest from long disuse. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. A broken table, a single chair, and a rusted cot were the only furnishings. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform layer of grit. It felt like trespassing in a stranger's forgotten failure. I ran a hand over the table, leaving a clean streak in the dust. My light brown backpack felt heavy on my shoulders. It held water, some dried meat, a bedroll. Enough for the journey, enough to see this final piece of my father's life and put it behind me. I had come to understand what I needed to do. I would pay the taxes, and then I would sell the land for whatever I could get. The money would be a buffer, a small security in a world that had proven to have none. It was a practical decision. It was the kind of decision my father, a man of maps and measurements, would have understood. I walked the perimeter of the small room. My boots made soft sounds on the floorboards. Then I saw it. A detail that didn't fit. In the far corner, near the stone hearth, the floor was clean. Not just less dusty, but clean. A perfect rectangle of bare wood, about 3 feet by 4, stood out against the grey film covering everything else. The lines were too sharp, too deliberate. It was a space that had been covered until recently. I knelt, my knees protesting on the hardwood. I ran my fingers along the edges of the clean space. The floorboards here were different. They were not nailed down in the same haphazard way as the rest of the floor. I pressed down on one. It gave slightly, a small movement, but it was there. I pushed aside the broken table and used its one good leg as a lever, wedging it into the seam. The wood creaked. With a final, sharp shove, a section of the floor lifted. It wasn't just floorboards, it was a door. A heavy, plank trap door, flush with the floor, its existence perfectly concealed. My heart, which I had thought was a dull, steady muscle, began to beat a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. Beneath the door was darkness. A square of absolute black. A handle had been carved into the underside of the door. I reached for it, then stopped. Tucked into a small, hollowed-out space in the earth beside the opening was a metal box. It was a simple lockbox, the kind used for important papers. It was not old or rusted. It was clean. I lifted it out. It was heavy. There was no key. I looked around the desolate cabin. There was nothing. I thought of the lawyer, of the deed, of the strangeness of this inheritance. My father was a deliberate man. He did nothing without reason. He had left this for me. He had to have left a way to open it. I went back outside, my eye scanning the ground, the cabin walls, anything. My gaze fell on the hearth inside. The stones were irregular, covered in soot. I ran my hands over them, feeling for anything loose, any hollow space. Nothing. I stood up, frustrated. I looked at the clean rectangle on the floor, at the dark opening, at the box in my hands. The answer had to be here. My father had trusted me to find it. I thought back. He always said to look at the whole picture, not just the pieces. The cabin, the land, the box. I walked back to the hearth, my eyes tracing the lines of mortar between the stones. And then I saw it. Not a loose stone, but a mark. A tiny, almost invisible scratch on the third stone from the top on the left side. It was a surveyor's mark, one of his own making, a symbol he had used on his maps. I had seen it 1,000 times. I pressed on the stone. It didn't move. I pushed harder, using my shoulder. A low grinding sound came from within the chimney, and the stone pivoted inward, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside, sitting on a dusty ledge, was a single, heavy iron key. My hands were shaking as I fitted the key into the lock of the metal box. It turned with a solid, satisfying click. I lifted the lid. Inside, there were no coins, no valuables in the traditional sense. There was a stack of papers, a slim leather-bound ledger, and another, smaller key, this one made of brass and intricately cut. On top of the papers was a folded note. My father's handwriting, unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. It was the first piece of him I had seen in 3 years that wasn't a memory. I unfolded the paper. The note was short, his words as spare and precise as he had been. Cora, if you are reading this, I did not make it back. But I am not gone. Do not sell this land. Trust no one, especially not Davies. The land is not what it seems. Your future is in the well. The third stone from the north. The answer is below. Burn this. Be brave. I love you. Davies. The name meant nothing to me. The well. I had seen it on my way in, a collapsed circle of stones a few hundred yards from the cabin, choked with weeds and debris. It looked like it had been dry for a century. I read the note again, the words sinking in. I am not gone. What could that mean? A ghost? A metaphor? My father did not deal in metaphors. He was a man of rock and soil and water. I did as he asked. I took the note to the hearth, struck a match from my pack, and watched the paper curl into black ash. The smell was acrid. I took the box's contents and secured them in my backpack. The ledger, the papers, the small brass key. Then I walked out of the cabin, into the stark, unending sunlight, and headed for the well. The stones that ringed the well were massive, half buried in the earth. The opening was a dark moor, filled with rocks and dead branches. It looked impossible, final. The third stone from the north. I found the north side, the stones there covered in a thin, pale moss that grew only in the shade. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. The third stone was enormous, a slab of granite that must have taken 3 men to move. It was flat on top, settled deep into the ground. There was no seam, no handle, nothing to suggest it was anything other than what it was, a rock. I pushed against it. It was immovable. I remembered the table leg in the cabin. I ran back, my boots slipping on the loose shale, my lungs burning. I returned with the sturdy piece of wood and jammed it into the thin space between the third stone and its neighbor. I put all my weight on it. Nothing. The sun beat down on my head. Sweat dripped into my eyes. I thought of my father's words. Be brave. I repositioned the lever, finding a better purchase deep in the crack. I pulled this time, throwing my entire body into the effort. There was a groan, not of wood, but of earth and stone. A grinding, protesting sound. The massive stone shifted. An inch. It was enough. I worked the lever again, and it moved another few inches, revealing a dark line in the dirt beneath it. I dropped the lever and dug at the line with my hands, my fingers raw against the sharp soil. I uncovered a recessed iron ring, thick with rust. I hooked my fingers through it and pulled. The stone was a lid, a heavy, perfectly balanced plug. It pivoted on a hidden mechanism, swinging upward and revealing not the dark shaft of a well, but a set of steep, narrow steps carved directly into the rock. They descended into cool, silent darkness. The air that rose from the opening was cold, smelling of damp earth and stone, a scent of places that never saw the sun. It was the smell of a tomb. But my father's words echoed in my mind. The answer is below. I took a breath, slung my pack more securely over my shoulders, and started down the steps, leaving the bright, hostile world behind for the unknown dark. The steps were slick with a fine, damp grit. The darkness was absolute. I descended slowly, one hand trailing against the cold, rough-hewn wall. The air grew colder with every step. The silence was so complete it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. All I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, loud and ragged in the enclosed space, and the scuff of my boots on the stone. The stairway ended abruptly on a flat, earthen floor. I paused, letting my eyes adjust, but there was no light to adjust to. I retrieved a small oil lamp and a box of matches from my pack. My hands fumbled with the match, the scrape and flare of the flame startlingly violent in the stillness. The small light pushed back the oppressive dark, revealing a long, narrow tunnel. It was man-made, the walls shored up with thick timbers that looked impossibly old yet solid. The air was still and cold, but it was fresh. There was a draft. The tunnel wasn't a dead end. I held the lamp high and walked forward. The tunnel was longer than I expected, stretching on for what must have been 200 feet. It sloped gently downward. The only sound was the soft padding of my footsteps on the packed earth. Then I heard another sound. Faint, rhythmic. A soft, wet dripping. Water. I walked toward the sound, the small flame of my lamp dancing, casting huge, distorted shadows on the walls. The tunnel opened into a cavern larger than the cabin above, and it was here that I saw the source of the sound. Water dripped from the stone ceiling into a large cistern, the ripples spreading out in the lamplight. But that was not what stopped me. That was not what made the air leave my lungs in a single, silent rush. In the center of the room, on a simple cot, a man was lying. He was thin, his face gaunt and pale in the flickering light, his hair and beard overgrown and shot with gray. But I knew him. I would have known him anywhere. It was my father. His eyes were closed. For a terrible moment, I thought I had found him only to find him dead. I moved closer, my legs unsteady. The lamp trembled in my hand. I reached out a hand, not daring to touch him. And then his eyes opened. They were his eyes. Older, deeper set, but his. They focused on me, and a look of profound, weary relief washed over his face. He tried to sit up, and I rushed forward to help him. His arm was thin, all bone and sinew. "Cora," he whispered. His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of long disuse. "I knew you'd come." I couldn't speak. The words were locked in my throat, a hard knot of disbelief and a grief so deep it had become a part of my bones. I had mourned this man. I had buried him in my heart. And here he was, solid and breathing in this cold, dark place beneath the earth. "You're alive," I finally managed to say. The words were flat, inadequate. "I am," he said, his voice a little stronger. He looked at me, his gaze taking in my face, my hair pulled back in its familiar ponytail, the pack on my shoulders. "I am. And I am sorry. I am so sorry to have put you through this." He gestured around the cavern. There was a small table, a stack of books, crates of what looked like preserved food, and a desk covered in maps and papers. This was not a prison. It was a refuge. A place of waiting. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "This is the truth," he said, his eyes holding mine. "The truth of why I had to disappear. And why you can never sell this land." My father drank the water I offered him from my canteen, his hands trembling slightly as he held the cup. He looked fragile, a man hollowed out by time and darkness, but as he began to speak, the familiar strength returned to his voice, the quiet authority I remembered so well. He told me everything. He had not been on a simple surveying trip 3 years ago. He had been mapping this land, his own land, confirming a theory he had worked on for years. This worthless patch of scrub was a geological anomaly. It sat atop a massive, undiscovered aquifer, a vast underground river of fresh water. In a territory where water was more valuable than gold, it was an immeasurable fortune. It was the future. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice low. I was excited. I wrote a letter to an old colleague at the Territorial Survey Office, outlining my findings. That colleague worked for a man named Alistair Davies, the name from the note. "Davies isn't a government man," my father continued. "He works for the railroad syndicate. They're buying up thousands of acres, planning a new line through the territory. But their route is dry. They need water, vast amounts of it, for the steam engines, for the work crews, for the towns they plan to build. My discovery would solve all their problems. It would also make them the most powerful entity in the territory. They would control who gets water and who doesn't, who thrives and who withers. Davies had come to him, offering to buy the 70 acres. First with politeness and a generous sum, then with pressure, and finally with threats. My father refused. He knew that selling to Davies would be selling away the future of every small rancher and homesteader for 100 miles. I knew they wouldn't just let it go, he said, gesturing to the cavern. I had been preparing this place for years, just in case. A bolt hole. When I realized they were closing in, that they were willing to do anything to get this land, I staged my disappearance. I left my horse, my pack. I let them believe I had died in the wilderness. He had been down here for 3 years. Living in the dark, rationing his supplies, listening to the silence and waiting. Waiting for the legal process to declare him dead. Waiting for the land to pass to me. It was the only way, he said, his eyes pleading for me to understand. They couldn't take the land from a dead man. But they could take it from his heir. They were counting on you, Cora. A young woman, alone, grieving. They assumed you'd be grateful for a few $100s for a worthless piece of land. They underestimated you. He pushed himself up and walked to the desk. He unrolled a large, detailed map. It was a work of art, every contour of the land, every rock formation drawn with painstaking precision. And beneath it, outlined in blue, was the aquifer, a huge, sprawling shape that dwarfed the 70 acres of the property above. He then opened the ledger I had found in the box. It was filled with his geological notes, water pressure readings, depth calculations. It was the scientific proof of his discovery. The other papers were copies of the letters exchanged between Davies and his superiors at the railroad. My father had an informant, a friend who had risked everything to get him this information. The letters were damning. They spoke of removing the obstacle and acquiring the asset through the daughter. They were a cold, calculated plan to defraud me, and if that failed, to take the land by force. My world, which had been simple and hard, was suddenly complex and terrifying. The grief I had carried for 3 years was not for a man lost to the wilderness, but for a man forced into a living tomb to protect me, to protect this place. The knowledge was a physical weight. The trust one had in the order of things, in law and decency, crumbled into dust. We were not safe. My father had supplies to last another year, but Davies and his men would not wait that long. They would be watching. The lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, was surely in Davies's pocket. He would report back that the deed was in my hands. Davies would make his move soon. We need more supplies, my father said. Fresh food. And lamp oil. I'm running low. He looked tired, the effort of his long explanation having drained him. I can ride to town, I said immediately. The nearest town was a day's ride, a small, dusty settlement where everyone knew everyone else's business. No, he said, shaking his head. Too risky. Davies will have someone watching the town. They'll see you buying supplies and know something is wrong. They think you're alone. He was right. My arrival would be noted. Questions would be asked. We had to assume we were under surveillance. There's Mrs. Gable, I suggested. Her ranch is the closest, just a few miles east. She was always kind to us. I remembered her from my childhood, a woman with a warm smile and hands that always smelled of flour and yeast. She had brought us a pie after the news first came about my father's disappearance. Her warmth had been a small comfort in a cold world. My father considered it. She keeps to herself. She might be safe. It was a risk, but a smaller one than riding into town. The next morning, before the sun had risen, I climbed out of the well into the pre-dawn grey. The world above felt alien after the stillness of the cavern. The air was thin and sharp. I secured the stone lid, camouflaging it with dirt and loose rocks, then rode east. Mrs. Gable's ranch was a neat, orderly place, a stark contrast to my father's abandoned claim. A thin curl of smoke rose from her chimney. She met me on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her smile was as I remembered it, wide and welcoming. Cora, child. What a surprise. What brings you all the way out here? I came to see the land my father left me, I said, keeping my voice even. I needed a few things. I was hoping I could buy some flour and oil from you, save myself the trip to town, of course, she said, bustling me inside. Her kitchen was warm and clean. She prepared coffee while I gave her my list. She talked as she moved, her voice a soothing murmur, asking about my life, how I was managing. It felt normal. It felt safe. Then she placed a cup of coffee on the table in front of me. It's a shame about your father, she said, her expression full of sympathy. He was a good man. So stubborn, though. Mr. Davies told me he tried to offer him a fine price for that useless land, just to be neighborly. Said your father nearly bit his head off. The cold stillness spread through my chest. She mentioned Davies so casually. Too casually. I took a sip of coffee. It was bitter. I looked at the tin of coffee beans on her counter. It was an expensive brand, one shipped in from the East, the kind of luxury a man like Davies would indulge in. Not the kind a woman like Mrs. Gable, who I knew had struggled for years, would buy for herself. Mr. Davies is a considerate man, she went on, not looking at me now, her hands busy measuring out flour. He was so concerned when he heard the land had passed to you. He worries about you, a young woman all alone. I kept my face passive. I filed away the information. Her practiced warmth. The casual mention of Davies. The expensive coffee. My father's warning echoed in my mind. Trust no one. This woman, who had offered me comfort in my grief, was his informant. She was watching me for him. The kindness was a performance. The betrayal was not a loud, violent act. It was quiet and intimate. It was the coffee she had just poured for me. It was the gentle questions designed to uncover my plans. I felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in my gut. It was a clean and clarifying feeling, burning away the last of my girlhood innocence. I paid her for the supplies, my hand steady. I thanked her for her kindness. Her smile did not reach her eyes. As I rode away from her ranch, the sack of flour and the can of oil heavy behind my saddle, I knew that my father and I were utterly, completely alone. The tree line on the horizon was no longer just a line of trees, it was a boundary between the known and the unknown, between cover and exposure. And we were on the wrong side of it. When I returned to the cavern and told my father about Mrs. Gable, a look of profound weariness crossed his face. He had hoped, as I had, for a small pocket of decency in the world. We had found none. Then they know you're here, he said. She'll report that you've come to inspect the property. Davies will make his move now. He'll come to you with his offer, expecting you to be naive and grateful. What do we do? I asked. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but my voice was clear. My father's years of quiet, methodical teaching had prepared me for this, if for nothing else. To face a problem, break it down into its constituent parts, and act. We don't run, he said, his voice firm. He walked over to his desk and pulled out the incriminating letters from the railroad syndicate. He tapped the geological survey maps. This is our weapon. Not a rifle, but the truth. We can't beat them with force. But we can expose them. His plan was simple and incredibly dangerous. We needed to get the evidence to someone Davies couldn't buy, bribe, or intimidate. There is a U.S. Marshal, my father explained. Eva Rostova. She's new to the territory, appointed by the federal government to investigate land and water rights fraud. She has a reputation for being thorough and incorruptible. She operates out of the territorial capital, 3 days' ride from here. The capital was a world away. To get there, I would have to get past Davies's men, who were likely already closing in. He'll be watching the roads, I said. He'll expect me to go to town for a lawyer, or to the county seat. Exactly, my father said. So you won't. You'll go north, through the Badlands. It's harder terrain, but they won't expect it. They won't be looking for you there. He folded the original maps and the letters, placing them in a waterproof oilskin pouch. These cannot fall into their hands. This is everything. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face. This is too much to ask. Cora, you didn't ask, I said. You trusted me to read a note and find a door. This is just the next step for the next 2 days. We prepared. We lived on the preserved food from my father's stores, saving the fresh supplies for my journey. He showed me the route on his maps, pointing out hidden springs and defensible positions, teaching me the language of the land he knew so well. I committed it all to memory. He would remain in the cavern. It was the safest place for him. I would be the one to move. The one to act. It was a strange reversal of roles. For my entire life, he had been the strong one, the protector. Now, his life, and the future of this land, depended on me. On the third morning, as I packed the oilskin pouch deep into my backpack, he handed me the small, brass key from the lockbox. What is this for? I asked. There's a postbox at the bank in the capital, he said. Number 37. I opened it years ago under a different name. There are copies of everything, and a signed affidavit. If anything happens to you, or to the originals, this is our insurance. It was another layer of his meticulous planning. A fail-safe. He had thought of everything. He had spent 3 years in the dark, thinking. As I stood at the bottom of the steps, ready to leave, he placed a hand on my shoulder. His grip was surprisingly strong. You look like your mother, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. She was brave, too, I nodded, unable to speak. I turned and climbed the stone steps, pushing open the heavy rock lid into the cold morning light. The world felt sharp and dangerous. I was no longer a girl inheriting a piece of land. I was a messenger, carrying a truth that could get me killed. I rode away from the well, not east toward the roads and the towns, but north, toward the jagged, unforgiving silhouette of the Badlands. The Badlands were a maze of canyons and ravines, a landscape designed to confuse and conceal. I kept to the low ground, following the route my father had mapped out, my horse picking its way carefully over the rocky terrain. Twice, I saw riders in the distance, silhouetted against the sky on the ridges above. They were too far away to see me, but their presence was a constant pressure. They were hunting. On the second day, I found the spring my father had marked on the map, a thin trickle of water seeping from a rock face into a small, clear pool. I let my horse drink its fill and refilled my canteens. As I rested in the shade of an overhang, I ate some of the dried meat from my pack and studied the maps again. The silence of the Badlands was different from the silence of the cavern. It was alive, filled with the whisper of the wind, the cry of a hawk, the distant rattle of a snake. It was a watchful silence. I felt exposed, vulnerable. But I was not afraid. The anger I had felt in Mrs. Gable's kitchen had cooled into a hard, steady resolve. Davies and his men had taken 3 years of my father's life. They had tried to steal my future. They had mistaken my quietness for weakness. They would not make that mistake again. I rode on, pushing myself and my horse, sleeping for only a few hours at a time in hidden arroyos. The journey was a blur of rock and sky, of thirst and exhaustion. But the thought of my father, waiting in the dark, was a constant spur. On the morning of the 4th day, I saw it. The territorial capital, a smudge of buildings in the vast, flat plain ahead. The sight of it was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. The wilderness was dangerous, but it was simple. The town was a different kind of maze, one of walls and streets and people. One where Davies's influence could be hiding behind any corner. I waited until dusk before riding into the outskirts, my clothes covered in dust, my face grim. I avoided the main streets, sticking to the alleyways. I found the U.S. Marshal's office in a modest brick building between a blacksmith and a saloon. A single lamp burned in the window. I tethered my horse in a dark alley, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. A man with a rifle sitting on a chair outside the office watched me approach. "Office is closed for the day. I need to see Marshal Rostover," I said. "It's urgent." He looked me up and down, taking in my trail-worn appearance. The marshal isn't seeing anyone tell her it's about Alistair Davies and the railroad syndicate, I said, my voice low and clear. The deputy's expression changed. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and disappeared inside. A minute later, the door opened again. A woman stood in the doorway. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple dress, but there was a badge pinned to her collar and a pistol holstered at her hip. She looked competent and tired. "I'm Marshal Rostover," she said. Her voice was calm, with no hint of an accent. "You have something to tell me about Mr. Davies." "I have something to show you," I said. She studied my face for a long moment, then stepped aside. Come in. The office was spare and functional. A desk, 2 chairs, and walls lined with maps and wanted posters. I took the oilskin pouch from my backpack and laid it on her desk. "My name is Cora," I said. "And my father is Samuel. He is supposed to be dead for the next hour." I told her everything. I did not embellish or speculate. I presented the facts as I knew them, just as my father had presented them to me. I showed her the maps, the ledger, the letters. She listened without interruption, her eyes moving from my face to the documents on her desk. She read the letters from Davies' superiors twice, her expression hardening. When I was finished, the silence in the room was heavy. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. "I've been investigating Davies for months," she said, her back to me. "Rumors of coercion, fraudulent claims. But I've had no proof. He's careful. He has powerful friends." She turned back to face me. "This," she said, tapping the letters with her finger, "is the proof." There was no skepticism in her voice. Only a cold, professional anger. She believed me. The relief was so profound it almost made my knees buckle. "Your father is a brave man," she said. "And so are you. Where is he now?" "He's safe," I said. "And he'll stay there until you have Davies in custody." She nodded. "Good. You'll give me a statement. Then you will go to the hotel across the street and stay there. A deputy will be outside your door. You are a material witness now. You are in my protection for the first time in a long time." The weight on my shoulders felt a little lighter. I had carried the message. I had delivered the truth. Now, the law would have to do its part. Davies arrived 2 days after I gave my statement to the marshal. I was watching from my hotel room window when he rode up to the cabin, a buggy behind him carrying Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer. They were not expecting a confrontation. They were expecting a simple transaction. They found my horse gone, the cabin empty. I had left it exactly as I'd found it, the trapdoor concealed, the lockbox gone. I could imagine their confusion, their mounting frustration. They searched the property, their movements agitated and angry. They were there for an hour before they gave up and left. They did not know I was 100 miles away, watching a different street from a different window. They did not know the law was already coming for them. The next day, Davies came to the capital. He must have assumed I had run to the nearest town, and he had come to find me, to intimidate me into signing the deed. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He walked into the marshal's office with an air of confident authority. I watched it all from my window. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic scene. Davies went in. A few minutes later, 2 deputies emerged and calmly removed the rifles from his saddle. Marshal Rostover herself escorted him out of the office, his hands bound in front of him. His face was a mask of shock and disbelief. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated me, and he had underestimated the law. Mr. Abernathy was arrested an hour later in his office. Mrs. Gable was taken into custody the following day. The entire conspiracy, built on years of greed and intimidation, collapsed in a matter of hours. The truth, once exposed to the light, was a powerful thing. Marshal Rostover came to my hotel room that evening. "It's over," she said. "We have them all. Their own records incriminate them further than we could have hoped. The railroad is disavowing all knowledge, of course. "They're cutting Davies loose and the land?" I asked. "The deed is legally yours. No one will challenge it now. The federal government will be taking an interest in that aquifer. They'll want to ensure it's managed properly, for the public good. But the rights, and the compensation for those rights, will belong to you and your father." She looked at me, a flicker of something like respect in her tired eyes. "You should go home. Your father is waiting." The journey back was different. I was no longer running or hiding. I rode under an open sky, the weight of the secret lifted. I did not go through the Badlands, but took the main road, a straight, clear path. When I reached the 70 acres, the land no longer looked worthless to me. It looked like a promise. It looked like a future. I rolled back the stone lid of the well and descended the steps. The lamp was lit in the cavern. My father was sitting at his desk, waiting. He looked up as I entered, his face etched with worry. "It's done," I said. "They're arrested." "It's over." He closed his eyes, and a long, slow breath escaped him. The tension he had been holding for 3 years seemed to drain away, leaving him looking older and more fragile than ever. He had won. We had won. He stood up and walked toward me. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around me, and for the first time since I was a small child, I felt the solid, reassuring strength of my father's embrace. He was no longer a ghost, no longer a memory. He was real. And he was home. Months passed. Winter came, blanketing the high desert in a thin, clean layer of snow. The silence was no longer watchful or threatening, it was peaceful. We brought my father's things up from the cavern and sealed the well for good. The cabin, which had once seemed a monument to failure, slowly became a home. We fixed the door, replaced the broken window pane, and built new furniture from scavenged lumber. My father's strength returned in increments. Color came back to his face. He began to walk the land again, not as a fugitive, but as its guardian. He spent his days mapping the surface, planning where to build a proper house, how to best manage the incredible resource that lay beneath our feet. I worked alongside him. The quiet companionship was a balm. We didn't talk much about the 3 years he had been gone, or about Davies and the arrests. There was no need. The shared work of building a new life was conversation enough. We were healing, not by speaking of the wound, but by building scar tissue over it, strong and resilient. One afternoon, a wagon appeared on the horizon. It was Marshal Rostova. She had come not on official business, but on her own. She brought news. Davies and his conspirators had been convicted. They would be in federal prison for a very long time. The railroad had been forced to reroute their line, at great expense. The water under our land was now officially under federal protection, to be managed in a trust that would benefit the entire territory. Our family would be the stewards of that trust. After delivering the news, she sat with us at our small kitchen table, the table I had once used as a lever to find the truth. She drank coffee from a simple tin mug. She looked less like a marshal and more like a woman who had carried a heavy burden and was now able to set it down. "What will you do now?" she asked my father. "I'm going to watch the grass grow," he said, a small smile touching his lips. It was the first time I had seen him smile in years. Before she left, Marshal Rostova looked at me. "The West is changing," she said. "It's going to need more people like you. People who believe in the law, but also know when to take matters into their own hands." Her words stayed with me. I was not the same person who had mended a broken bridle in a dusty barn half a year ago. That girl had been living in the shadow of a memory. I was living in the light of a hard-won truth. The following spring, a family of homesteaders settled on the neighboring parcel of land. They had a young daughter, a girl of about 6 named Lucy, with bright, curious eyes. She would often wander over to our property, her parents' permission given freely now that the story of the water was known. They, like everyone else, saw my father not as a mad recluse, but as a hero. Lucy was fascinated by our cabin, by the stories of the land. She was not afraid of my father's gauntness or his quiet demeanor. She would follow me as I worked in the garden, asking endless questions. One morning, she came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. The old machine gurgled and hissed, a familiar, comforting sound. She opened and closed the kitchen cabinets, not looking for anything, just exploring the world with the simple, direct curiosity of a child. She was the future my father had fought to protect. She was the reason the water mattered. My father came in from outside, his cheeks red from the cold morning air. He saw Lucy playing with the cabinet doors and he stopped, just watching her. The winter light, flat and clear, streamed through the new window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. In that quiet, ordinary moment, the smell of coffee, the clear light, the sound of a child's simple game, I understood the nature of our victory. It wasn't about the money or the land itself. It was about this. The chance for a future. The return of the ordinary. The quiet, steady work of living.